I guess following on to what Senator Bennett said, I think that's what's so exciting about tax reform, and I think it goes to, in my view, more the economic growth and the wage improvement that is going to come from good tax reform. And it's across the board. If you look at Kevin Hassett's work, he's now the new chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors as of a couple days ago, and other studies that have been done, including by AEI. Corporate rates, if they are lowered and we have a more competitive international system, will result primarily in wage growth, wage and benefits. And CBO has a famous study on this from a while ago showing it's 70%. Others have different numbers, but the point is that's about wages. On the individual side, I think the same is true. If you do, in fact, broaden the base, get rid of some of the complexity of the code and lower rates, I think it'll have the same benefit. So to the extent we're concerned about what Senator Bennett said, which I agree on, which is kind of the middle-class squeeze, higher expenses on everything, especially health care for most middle-class families, and then flat wages, which is generally true over the last couple of decades. This is, I think, the single best thing to do. So 2006, there was a study shown, done by the Joint Committee that found that a proposal that would expand the tax base while lowering individual rates across the board by about 25% would increase GDP up to 3.5% in the long run. That increase in the second half of the budget window is about $2,500 to $5,000 increase in income for a family of 4. So that's on the individual side. And so I think both on the individual side and the business side, we've got a great opportunity here. I would just ask Alex, because you talked about this some in your testimony, in recent tax reform efforts, base broadening, rate reduction, have been coupled with, in general, this doubling of the standard deduction. We talked a lot about that today. You talked about who benefits from itemizing, who doesn't. But do you see any benefit in reducing the number of taxpayers that have to itemize, just from a compliance point of view as well?
I do, Senator. Thank you for your question. There are a number of benefits from reducing the number of itemizers, including, in particular, the compliance costs associated with itemizing, as well as this horizontal equity issue that I described in my testimony. The taxpayers earning similar incomes should ideally, I think, pay roughly similar amounts of taxes.
$273 is the estimate that we have for people who itemize, who have to have someone else prepare their tax returns. So that's saving some money right there in terms of compliance costs. On Rothification, we talked about that earlier. Senator Cardin talked about it. Senator Isaacson, Lily, you answered it. Alex, you answered it. I think what we're missing, though, in terms of the back and forth here, is the effect on behavior. So I understand the timing issue. That's always frustrated me. And Ben Cardin and I have struggled with this over the years. How do you help to expand 401ks and IRAs and not pay the penalty for it? Ultimately, that tax is paid. It's deferred, but not within the 10-year window. But with regard to Rothification, I just wanted to ask you, and clearly you can tell, of my concern, do you think that would create a disincentive to save? Because part of the issue that I look at is you do have the choice now of Rothification, and that's good. I'm glad we have that choice, which means that you don't get the tax benefit up front. You don't get a deduction. But you take a risk what the tax rate will be later when you have to pay it. Whereas with the traditional IRA or 401k, you get a tax deduction. And I talked to some businesses this week who say the take-up on the Roth is very low. I mean, we're talking less than 5% of people taking it up. So if we go to Rothification in order to make our numbers look better, what's going to be the incentive to save? I mean, we have a serious issue in our country right now, people not saving enough as the baby boomers begin to retire and are living longer. Wouldn't we want to encourage savings, and are you concerned about Rothification in that context?
I am. As Lily described earlier in her testimony, there are circumstances where, in theory, it's a wash. There are circumstances where it's not a wash, depending on what your current tax rate is versus your future tax rate. So you could write down, an accountant can write down why these are two neutral or equivalent policies. But what matters is the real-world evidence. As you suggested, the take-up rates for Roths are significantly lower. And I think there's a fair amount of uncertainty about how a change, instead of as the choice that we have today, if that policy was mandated in some sense as your savings vehicle, how that might affect. I frankly don't know what the effect is, and I think that policymakers should be cautious.
And I think there's some studies being done right now. And Lily, you have a comment on that?
I mean, I think as a matter of theory, one could argue it either way. It's possible it could increase savings. There's also strong arguments, and I think you're raising one, that it could decrease savings. But I think this gets to the broader point that if one were to have such a dramatic change in retirement savings policy, you'd want to have a group like the Joint Committee on Taxation estimate what the effects would be on take-up and savings. And I think it also goes to the broader point that the single biggest thing that influences people's likelihood to save is whether they have access to an easy way to save through their employer.
Okay.
And so personally, I would prioritize something like an auto IRA over this as a way to give people access to an easy way to save at work.
Well, thank you all. Thank you, Ramesh and Ms. Harrington, for your testimony as well.
Well, thank you, Senator.